Okay, hello again, everyone. This is video number 2 for the week of March the 30th. If you have not already watched video 1, which was a brief introduction to what an ethnography is and the specifics of the paper and the prompt itself, please go back and watch that video. At the end of that video, I also told you to do a reading. The reading is called Ethnography Reading on the front page of Canvas. So please, if you have not read that assignment, read that reading, or watched the previous video, please go do both of those things before we continue. This is going to be a brief video going over that reading, writing an ethnographic essay, what you all have read from the front page of Canvas labeled Ethnography Reading. Okay, I'm not going to read it to you. You've already read it, but I'm going to go over some things that generally we talk about, would talk about in class, and people might have some questions on. Right now, you should already be thinking about, oh man, I have to write a paper about a group of people. Could this just be 45-year-olds? Could this just be students? Could this just no? It can't be. It has to be much more specific than that. It has to be a group of people that identifies as that group of people for a purpose. These people are identifying as a certain group of people for a reason. I used the example of Alcoholics Anonymous. Those are a group of alcoholics that identify as such in order to live a better life and to provide help to others who might also need a better life or want a better life. Okay, so I really want to stress specificity here because, again, it's going to be awfully hard to write a paper about here's what students are and what students are about. Yeah, they want to get good grades and contribute to society and have a career. Okay, most of us know that. But why? But what's more interesting? What's a different purpose? What can we talk about specifically? I brought up examples of people in the civil rights movement, the '60s, people in the civil rights movement now, people. We'll see. Um, so let's kind of quickly go over the reading. Normally I would call on people, but there's no one here, so I'll raise my own hand and we'll talk about certain things. This is written by Bruce Ballinger from a different textbook, which I wish we had to use because it's good and it talks about what an ethnography does specifically. But he uses this kind of flowery metaphor at the beginning, as you may have seen, about spiders and webs and subcultures. So I'll say a little bit, repeat a little bit of the phrases that he says. Like the spiders in our basement, subcultures abound right under our very noses. We just have to learn to see the webs they weave. Meaning, these factions of society exist often everywhere, and it's just up to us to kind of dig in and see where it goes. I don't know about you, but I've had lots of friends I consider close, or just acquaintances I know, or people I've worked with for a long time, where all of a sudden I go, "Oh, I didn't know you were a part of that. I didn't know that. I didn't know that you were this. Let me see what that means." And all of a sudden there's a whole another aspect to them you never understood or you never expected. Um, Many of you are in groups that I wouldn't expect or never know about. I had someone one time in a class write about being a roller derby girl in New Orleans. Fascinating. Again, I wouldn't have known if she wouldn't have told me. So uh, try to find just groups that people identify with, even if because that's what's interesting. Uh, and they're always moving around and they're always everywhere. We just got to dig and we just got to find people. Okay, he says the web of culture is a good metaphor because, like spider webs, the many cultures and subcultures we encounter in our everyday lives are often difficult to detect. That's why we have to dig. Okay, there's his definition for ethnography: a method of inquiry into culture that exposes cultural webs, much the way the morning dew exposes the intricacies of a spider web in your backyard. That's a kind of a overdone metaphor there. But what he's saying is that And ethnography is pretty much you, the process of you discovering how a group moves, interacts, and changes within the world it is in. So, if someone were to be writing about Alcoholics Anonymous, is it the same as it was? Has it evolved? How does it affect society at large now? How is it interacting, and how do people identify? Do they have artifacts, little coins that say it's been 1 year, etc., etc.? Details, specificity. Um, you've read the motives for writing an ethnography, which is on the second page here. Motives for writing just means why you might want to. I'm going to leave that to you to keep to read. But he does bring up the example of Jersey Shore, Orange County housewives, and which I like that he does is these shows that you may have come across. What are they all doing? They're studying a very specific group of people. The people that live on Jersey Shore are almost caricaturized now for being this certain group of bizarre individuals, and we're fascinated and we can't look away because we want to see how they move, how they interact, where they go in the real world. How does the real world look at them? What consequences does this have? Does it make New Jersey look strange? Does it make this process, etc., etc.? Reality TV shows are a good example. Another good example that happens to be very relevant right now. I don't know if you, like a lot of other people right now, are obsessed with the Tiger King documentary on Netflix, which is a perfect example of an ethnography about people who run or look after big cats in the United States. Run, raise, and look over big cats in the United States. It exposes this world we didn't even know existed the way it did. Maybe you did, but I didn't, and many people didn't. I knew there were roadside zoos and smaller zoos and rescues. And in fact, as an aside, very quickly, the big cat rescue that Kate Baskin runs is exists in my hometown within a 15-minute drive from the house in which I grew up. I went there on field trips and family excursions. I very much know that place, but knew nothing about it as detailed as this documentary does. But go watch that documentary on Netflix. I'm not going to focus on it, but if you have, which I assume a lot of you probably have at this point, it it focuses on a very specific group of people, isolates the characters. You have just if you haven't seen it, just pretend these names are just characters. But it Joe Exotic is a character. Carol Baskin is a character. The Tigers themselves are a character. How they sell these things, how they make money, how they do all this. Those are the those are the ways that that group of people interact with the world. Quidditch players on Tulane's campus. I keep using this kind of fictional idea just because it's one day it was the first thing that popped to my mind. Um, how do they speak to people passing by? How do they distribute their information? How do they meet? How do they meet each other? How do they get involved in the first place? What do they do while they're playing Quidditch? How do they organize outside of it? How do they live outside of that world? How do they present it? What are the secrets that go on under it? All of these things are behind what Ballinger here calls a veil of objectivity, meaning, he's saying, kind of a sheet that seems objective. And once you break through that objective data, you use your analysis to say, oh, this is what's happening, and this is what the purpose of this group is. Everything has a purpose. That's why we are writing an ethnography. Um, Continue reading, but I will skip to some of the technical aspects, which are very important. This is how you get your research. This is how you get your research. We touched on it in the last one. Field or online observations. The key word now being online because that's kind of all we have access to during this particular time. Field observations is how I will refer to them. But essentially, any way that you can see these people interacting with each other. There is a group of people, some of you might know of, called the um, Juggalos, which are rabid fans of the Insane Clown Posse, a rap group that's existed for a while, and they hold these big gatherings, and there's thousands and thousands, if not millions, of of insane clown posse fans who call themselves juggalos. And it's a fascinating world with dynamics you wouldn't expect from an outside perspective. You might think one thing and get another. Maybe you've never heard of them. Check them out. There's a really interesting but explicit, with lots of drug use and language, documentary online about them that I can't assign for that reason, but it's kind of worth looking at. Uh, a study of people that illuminates reasoning and purpose and maybe community. Um, so these are your ways. Again, these are your ways of research: field observations, interviews, which will probably be your primary source, one of your primary sources right now into that actual world, because we live in a wonderful age of technology now where we can actually get a hold of people and interview them and ask them questions. There is a guide posted on the front page of Canvas on underneath readings and various material that shows you some questions you might want to ask. I want to briefly say right now, in regards to conducting your interviews, the interview questions are very loose, meaning one of the important things about interviews and interviewing someone is that you might ask one question and you get an answer that leads you to other questions that aren't necessarily on the sheet, but you know will be important. You might say, well, uh, where do you meet up and at what time for to play Quidditch? And they say at 3 o'clock every Wednesday afternoon. But sometimes my pink socks are missing, and you go, your pink socks are missing. What do? And then you all of a sudden have a different route for questioning. What exactly are your pink socks? Why do you need them to play Quidditch? All of a sudden, that might become very important information that about the group and what they do. Um, Again, you want to gather all this up. Just consider this like an argumentative paper or anything you've ever written. You're just collecting a giant pile of information that you will then dig through as you draft and go, what's relevant? And remember that word. I don't want to just know everything about this group, especially if you just tell me they wear pink socks and not why, or that they just play Quidditch but not why. I want a giant pile of information that you gather and then you dig through and place in certain organization that is important. Um, your photographs, video, and audio recordings can all be, forget audio recordings because we're writing papers, but those are all ways to get research, collection, and study of artifacts. You will see the word artifacts a lot in these readings because artifacts are important, meaning, just a simple example, the Quidditch players use real vintage, expensive, artisan made broomsticks to play Quidditch. That's a little bit more interesting. I mean, that adds some detail that's interesting than just a random broomstick they buy at Walmart or something, right? There's something interesting there. We have to take that and analyze that. Do they use specific language to each other? Do they say spells from the Harry Potter books? Do they do they make their whatever it's called, the ball they used to play, out of cotton, or do they get it made in handcrafted gold from France? It all says something about the group. Like I said, an AA member, an Alcoholics Anonymous member, might carry around a coin that says 1 year sober. That's an artifact. These are important. What a protester might hold up a sign, a specific sign, or wear a specific shirt all the time. A volunteer for an organization might wear an orange vest, might have a certain shirt, might, etc., etc. Artifacts, physical things that they use that are unique. These are very interesting and important things to put into your ethnographic papers. And then another thing he says is background research. You need to study where this came from, what they were doing in the past, and why that might lend itself to some relevance now. Okay. Okay. And again, the features of the form section on this reading are very important because it breaks it down into this box structure that you really want to think about. They have their inquiry questions you need to ask yourself. How do the people in a social group or culture see themselves in the world? Not that they just self-identify as Quidditch players at Tulane, but why do they and how do they? Do they scream it from the rooftops? Do they keep it quiet and try to keep it secret? Do they meet, etc.? How do they show themselves? How do they present themselves? Um, how do they view themselves? Noble. We're noble, powerful people that want to keep the heritage alive from Harry Potter. That's a lot different than someone just saying, "Oh, I just want to have fun and I don't really care." But it's a difference, and it's important to highlight. Um, I should talk about motives. Um, you need to look through this box uh, to discuss a bit. Subject matter. Now, this one is very important because it's something I wanted to talk about in the last video, but this puts it more specifically and in a better way than I could. It says we all belong to subcultures that we don't recognize we belong to, or perhaps we refuse to acknowledge. This is important. We all do, whether we believe in individualism to the extreme, we all actually exist in a subculture. Um, because that's where life has placed us. Um, so they keep saying, or keeps Ballinger here keeps saying, but ethnography tends to focus on people who, at least when pressed, freely identify with a specific group. So if you were to press me, I would have to find something I identify with and be able to recognize it. It can't just be you going up to a person to write your ethnography about and say, "Hey, I know you're this, so I'm going to write about you." No, they have to go, oh, okay, I see that I'm that. I'm willing to talk about being a part of that culture. I'm willing to talk about being a fan of uh, ballet in New Orleans, for example. Um, they have to identify in some way so that they give you accurate information. Otherwise, it becomes this accusatory relationship between you and your subject. You don't want to do that. Okay? And then we'll talk about structure because that's always the most pressing question from students, and rightfully so. So here are three different ways that Ballinger suggests structuring your paper, and I like this because none of them is the 5-paragraph essay form, although you can still use that. This is more of a general idealistic view of putting the papers together. One is a typical day. A typical day. I like to call this a day in the life structure, meaning what does it look like for group members? Like what does a typical day? Here's a day in the life of Jonathan J. Longjeans, who is a Quidditch player every Wednesday on Tulane's campus in New Orleans. That's very specific, and we're using character, which we have talked about all semester. We are showing one character interacting with other characters in their setting. We're writing scenes about their setting. We're showing the interaction with Jonathan J. Longjeans. We're showing snippets of our interview. Snippets of our interview, not a transcript. Um, the transcript being the entire conversation. We're treating it like research and data, small excerpts of our conversations. We're seeing Jonathan J. Longjeans do the action details of what his group stands for. He scores at the last minute and he calls his mom immediately, etc. Their movements and actions, your subject. So that's a day in the life structure. And you can mix these different structures. Another structure is called the collage. We all know what collages are, like a picture. You see different things, not necessarily in causal or linear order. It says here a series of richly described scenes. We all know how to write a scene now. So maybe we show Jonathan J. Longjeans steps onto the dewy grass at 6 in the morning at Tulane in New Orleans. Martha May Short Jeans steps onto a firefly covered lawn in Maine to play Quidditch at the University of Maine or whatever. Um, all of a sudden, we've brought New Orleans to Maine and we've broadened the scope of people, but still with a very specific idea. So trying to get in more than just one person's perspective. We're talking about two different. And maybe we've interviewed one, and maybe we've seen one online, and maybe we're able to analyze their difference. Remember the word analyze. So we've seen them, and now we're going to analyze how they're different. Now, This is important to say, and I wish I could repeat it 1,000 times, so I hope you watch these videos very intensely. Um, Another aspect that's not talked about enough in an ethnography is the difference between highlighting the differences between two members of a group, or one member versus many other members of that group. Why is this member different from the rest of the group? What are there different factions in the group? Are there people who like? Are there Quidditch players who like to protect the sanctity of the Harry Potter books, or are there Quidditch players that want to rewrite the whole history and be more violent Quidditch players? And how do they interact? And how is their friction? How are like there are like the women protesters after Trump's election? Did they all stand exactly for the same thing? What were their differences, and how does that affect their group? Do they fight? Do they find common ground? This is all very interesting and important to analyze in a group of people. So those are three different structures. Or, I'm sorry, I didn't say the third one, which is a narrative, and we've all done that, which is just a typical story. And they say the story of your understanding of the culture from your research. Now, this is where a personal narrative structure could be used for an ethnography. We're going to see an example of this soon. A narrative structure involves you and your discovery. It's the story of you exploring this group. For example, I woke up on the day of March 30th and decided to go to Tulane's campus and study this group of people I've always found fascinating. Uh, I've always thought so. I see Jonathan J. Longjeans put on his stockings and uh, bring out his broomstick to go run around the pitch and warm up and exercise. I watch the game. I see Martha interact with Jonathan J. and they fight about the differences of how they should play. They ask me, do I want to? And I say no. And I'm writing in a narrative sense. And all of a sudden I'm at that climax of the narrative triangle where I go, I once thought that they were reckless, uh, crazy people who lived in a fantasy world, but now I realize that they just, here's the retrospect, but now I realize that they just want community and they just want to decompress from the stress of school and connect with each other in a very close, similar way so that they're comforted from the stresses of college life. Okay, now that's a narrative structure that pretty much involves you. You are kind of the focus. They're still, that group is still the focus, but it's through your actions and your narrative, things happening to you. This is a very good way to write one. So just a quick recap. Typical day, a day in the life of this person to show the group, a collage, different scenes shoved together, and a narrative, your experience, showing that those are all three potentially different structures. That's about as far. Remember voice and tone. That's always important because that shows how your enthusiasm or how you want to display this group. Are you going to be funny? Are you going to be mad? Etc. Etc. We have talked about voice and tone, which is always important. So please, if you have not, by the time of watching this video, please read this and rewatch the video so that you can understand what the heck I just talked about. Bruce Ballinger's ethnography reading is what it's labeled as on Canvas. Now, here is another assignment. You need to read another reading, which we will talk about next week. You need to read, it is called Brony Ethnog, meaning Brony Ethnography. It is the file underneath ethnography reading. It is called Brony Ethnog. Please read the entire thing, and we're going to discuss it next week. I will probably ask of everyone some very specific questions, so you need to read this. So when we talk about it, we can break it down and use this model as an example, much like we did Dad the Ant Killer for a personal narrative and others. We need to break this down. So you need to read for next week, the week of I don't know off the top of my head. You need to read for next week. The reading called Brony Ethnog on the front page of Canvas. So please read that. Um, okay, that is this class. Please make sure from anything we've talked about, anything these videos said, any questions you might have, anything from the reading um, or the two videos that you want to talk about. You can even use the three base questions we always say. What's the best line? What's the best idea? What's the worst idea? What do you disagree with? What the heck does this all mean? What what can I ask that maybe someone in the discussion board might help with? So please do that by Friday, this Friday at midnight. This will be the last video this week. Ask me questions on Canvas if you'd like. Please read both ethnography reading, which we just went over, and Brony Ethnog. Brony Ethnog is the name of the file on Canvas for next week to talk about. You need to read them. Something else very quickly. Please upload your argumentative papers through Canvas in the appropriate way or you will receive a 0. I can't grade them without them being there. Okay, we're still focused on ethnography right now. Get your mind in that mode. Start thinking about groups of identified people. Start looking at the prompt and remember questions. Start thinking about what the heck do artifacts mean, interactions mean, scenes, details, causality. Let these words flood back to you. And once you start reading the Brony example, some of you may have heard what that means, but the ethnography will explain, and try to break it down and find these words and find the analysis and really think about it so we can discuss it. All right, thanks for putting up with this. The final video this week. Go on the discussion board by this Friday at midnight. Cool.